Close your eyes for a second. Actually, don't. Just slow down. You're sitting somewhere right now. Maybe it's warm. Maybe there's a blanket nearby. Maybe you haven't thought about the temperature in your room in the last 3 hours because there was absolutely no reason to. Now strip that away. No walls. No blanket. No heat. Just you. And a sky that has been getting darker earlier every single day for the past 2 months. And you don't know why. You have no calendar. You have no forecast. You have no word for winter. You just know that something is coming. And your body already knows it too. That is where this story begins. For roughly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens existed without a single one of the tools you use to survive cold today. No synthetic insulation. No central heating. No preserved food supply, stacked neatly in a climate-controlled room. And yet, here you are. You are the biological descendant of every single human being who did not die during a prehistoric winter. Let that land. Every ancestor in your line, going back hundreds of thousands of years, looked at the brutal edge of a season that could kill them in days and found a way through. The question isn't whether they survived. Obviously they did. The question is how. And the answer is stranger, more violent, more desperate, and honestly more impressive than almost anything you have been taught about early human life. Because winter for ancient humans wasn't an inconvenience. It wasn't a season you dressed for. It was a biological siege. A slow, invisible predator that didn't have claws or teeth, but killed more prehistoric humans than almost anything else that walked, crawled, or stalked in the dark. And understanding how they fought it tells you something deeply strange about the body you are living in right now. Here is something your biology does every single year, and you almost never notice it. As daylight shortens, as autumn starts compressing the hours of light your eyes receive, your brain begins shifting chemistry. Melatonin production increases. Serotonin pathways adjust. Your appetite begins subtly escalating, pushing you toward calorie-dense foods. You feel it as a vague craving, a mood shift, maybe a low-level sluggishness that shows up in October and doesn't leave until March. You call it the winter blues. Ancient humans didn't have a name for it, but their bodies were running the exact same program. And for them, that program wasn't a mood inconvenience. It was a survival mechanism. The hypothalamus, the part of your brain that regulates body temperature, hunger, and sleep, is exquisitely sensitive to light, specifically to the ratio of light to dark across a 24-hour cycle. As that ratio shifted in the prehistoric world, the hypothalamus essentially sent out a system-wide broadcast. Store. Slow. Prepare. Fat metabolism changed. Digestion prioritized calorie retention. Sleep architecture deepened, pushing ancient humans toward longer, heavier rest periods to conserve energy. Their bodies were doing something extraordinary. They were preloading for a threat that hadn't fully arrived yet. Pause for a second. Think about the last time you craved something heavy and carb-loaded in November. Pasta, bread, something warm and dense. That wasn't a personal failing. That was a 300,000-year-old instruction manual still running in the background of your nervous system. Your body was trying to keep you alive from a winter it no longer needs to fear. Let's talk about food, because this is where prehistoric winter survival stops being philosophical and becomes brutally mathematical. An adult human body burns roughly 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day at rest in temperate conditions. Add sustained cold exposure, the kind that dropped prehistoric nighttime temperatures to well below freezing across large parts of Europe and Central Asia, and that number climbs. Your body generates heat by burning fuel. When the external temperature drops, your metabolism accelerates to compensate. You shiver, which is just involuntary rapid muscle contraction to generate thermal energy, and shivering alone can increase caloric burn by 400% in sustained bursts. Ancient humans needed more calories in winter, at precisely the moment when food was disappearing. Megafauna migrations moved prey animals away from the coldest zones. Plant-based food sources, roots, berries, tubers, vanished under frost. Rivers froze, cutting off fish. The supply collapsed. The demand exploded. And ancient humans solved this problem in 3 ways that are so effective, they fundamentally restructured early human social organization. First, fat hoarding. Prehistoric hunting parties didn't kill prey and distribute the meat equally. They prioritized organ fat, liver, bone marrow, brain matter over muscle meat. These dense fat deposits carried roughly twice the caloric density of lean muscle. Killing a single large animal and targeting its fat reserves could keep a small group of humans metabolically stable for days in extreme cold. You know that trend of drinking bone broth? That's not wellness culture. That is an ancient survival technology that your ancestors used to not die in February. Second, caching. Some prehistoric groups, particularly those in Central Asian and Eastern European regions, developed primitive food caching behaviors. Meat stored in snow. Frozen fat deposits wedged into rock crevices. The cold itself became a preservation system. Nature's freezer. Except the cost of accessing, it was walking into temperatures that could kill an exposed human in under 2 hours. Third, radical reduction of activity. This one is uncomfortable. Some evidence from paleoanthropological analysis of skeletal wear patterns suggests that certain prehistoric human populations essentially entered semi-dormant behavioral states during deep winter. Not hibernation. Humans cannot hibernate. But drastically reduced movement. Conserved fire. Extended sleep periods of up to 12 to 14 hours. Minimal physical output beyond core survival tasks. They weren't lazy. They were computing. Every calorie spent moving unnecessarily in winter was a calorie subtracted from survival probability. Let's talk about fire. Not as a metaphor, not as a symbol, as the single most important survival technology in all of human prehistory, and the reason the species you belong to did not go extinct during the Pleistocene. The controlled use of fire by Homo sapiens, and before them, Homo erectus, fundamentally changed what winter meant for a human body. Before fire, winter was an absolute biological ceiling. Exposure killed. There was a hard temperature threshold below which a human body simply could not sustain life without external thermal regulation. After fire, that ceiling lifted. But fire did something even more profound than just keeping bodies warm. It restructured time. Before controlled fire, ancient humans were biologically synced to daylight. You wake with light. You hunt, gather, build, and move in light. You stop when dark comes, because dark meant predators you could not see, terrain you could not navigate, and a cold that dropped sharply the moment the sun left. Fire broke that contract. Suddenly there was a third zone of time, after dark, before sleep, illuminated, heated, protected. And in that zone, something happened that had never happened before in the evolutionary history of any species on Earth. Ancient humans started talking. Imagine you're sitting in that circle right now. Not metaphorically. Concretely imagine it. It is 27,000 years ago. Outside the cave entrance, the temperature is minus 15 degrees Celsius. The fire is the only light source in approximately 40 kilometers of darkness. You have 3 people beside you. You have eaten today, but not enough. There is no entertainment. There is no language in the form you know it. What do you do for the next 5 hours until sleep? You tell stories. You gesture. You reinforce social bonds that will determine whether the group hunts together tomorrow or fractures. Fire didn't just keep ancient humans. It gave them the neurological conditions for developing complex social cognition. Language. Ritual. The emotional architecture of what we now call culture. Winter forced them inside. Fire gave them light in the darkness. And what emerged from that forced proximity was the species you recognize today. Here is the part of this story that doesn't get told enough. Not everyone survived. The archaeological record is not just a testament to ancient human resilience. It is also a record of catastrophic, systematic seasonal death. Isotopic analysis of prehistoric skeletal remains across Eurasia shows consistent evidence of severe nutritional stress during late winter and early spring, a period paleoanthropologists call the Hunger Gap. This is the point, roughly late February to early April in the Northern Hemisphere. When winter food stores were exhausted, spring prey migrations hadn't returned, and plant sources hadn't yet emerged. The body starts consuming itself. First fat reserves, then muscle tissue, then organ function begins to deteriorate as the body cannibalizes its own protein. Skeletal remains from this period show growth arrest lines, Harris lines, literal marks in bone tissue where growth stopped entirely due to nutritional deprivation. Children were disproportionately affected. The very young and the very old had the lowest caloric reserves and the highest metabolic vulnerability. This was not an edge case. This was a recurring, predictable, annual mass mortality event. We have a tendency, and I include myself in this, to romanticize prehistoric survival. We talk about it like it was rugged and noble and cinematic. But the Hunger Gap was not cinematic. It was a slow biological collapse happening inside human bodies that had no framework to understand why. They just knew they were weakening, and they couldn't stop it. And the groups that made it through weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the most cooperative, the most socially bonded, the ones who shared food when sharing food felt impossible, the ones who maintained group cohesion when individual defection would have been biologically rational. The survivors of the Hunger Gap were not the apex predators of the prehistoric world. They were its most sophisticated social animals. Somewhere between 100,000 and 170,000 years ago, the exact date is still contested. Ancient humans made a cognitive leap so enormous that it permanently separated them from every other species on the planet. They looked at a dead animal, and instead of just eating it, they wore it. The development of clothing from animal hides was not an obvious step. It required a form of abstract reasoning that is genuinely staggering to consider. You had to understand that the dead animal's fur was performing a thermal regulation function on the animal that it could be made to perform on you. That is not instinct. That is technology. And the tools required to process hides, the scrapers, the awls, the bone needles that appear in the archaeological record roughly 50,000 years ago. Development. You don't make a bone needle by accident. You make a bone needle because you have a mental model of a future cold night and you are building a solution for it in the present. Forward planning. Anticipatory cognition. The ability to mentally simulate a future state and take preemptive action. Winter forced that cognitive evolution. The annual return of cold created a recurring selection pressure that punished improvisation and rewarded planning. The humans who thought ahead survived. The ones who didn't. And over hundreds of generations, that selection pressure quietly built the planning architecture that you use every single day without thinking about it. Every to-do list you've ever written. Every grocery run before storm. Every time you looked at the forecast and packed an extra layer. That's not modern behavior. That's winter, running a very old program. Here is where we have to be honest about something. All of the adaptations we've talked about, the metabolic shifts, the fat hoarding, the fire, the clothing, the planning, they weren't enough. Not always. Not for everyone. There were winters in prehistoric Eurasia, particularly during glacial maximum periods when global temperatures dropped by 8 to 12 degrees Celsius below modern averages that were not survivable. Not with fire, not with clothing, not with stored fat or cached meat or social cohesion. Some winters simply killed. Genetic analysis has revealed population bottleneck events. Moments in deep human prehistory where the total global population of Homo sapiens collapsed to numbers so low they're almost incomprehensible. Some estimates suggest that roughly 70,000 years ago, following the Toba supervolcanic eruption and the decade-long volcanic winter it triggered, the global human population may have fallen as low as 1,000 to 10,000 breeding individuals. 10,000 people on the entire planet. Every human alive today is descended from the survivors of that event. Every language, every culture, every person, from a group that could have fit inside a small town. The winter didn't just shape us. It nearly ended us. And the only reason it didn't was that somewhere in small scattered groups across the most thermally hospitable pockets of the ancient world, a few thousand people held on. They shared fire. They shared food. They told each other stories in the dark. And they made it a spring. Your body still runs the code. The melatonin shifts in November. The craving for density and warmth. The social pull towards smaller, closer spaces in the dark months. You didn't choose any of that. It was written into you by 300,000 years of people who had no other option but to survive. The brain decided a long time ago that this was a reasonable trade. You carry the memory of every winter your ancestors lived through. Not in your mind, but in your metabolism, your moods, your instinct to gather people close when the nights get long. And honestly, maybe it's for the best.